Caleb Azumah Nelson made a huge impression with his debut novel Open Water, an emotionally complex novel of love that was also a celebration of black creativity. His new novel, Small Worlds, continues both of those themes, whilst also looking at notions of family, home, and a connection with the author's own Ghanaian culture. We sat down for a talk about love, memory, and the creative urge. Caleb, it's fantastic to have some time to talk to you about your new book. I actually was hoping to get you in an earlier podcast. I had plans last year to put you together with two other writers, Lizzie Damalola Blackburn and Akweke Emetsi. And that was because the three of you had written books which, to varying degrees, you could maybe call romance books.
Yeah.
But they were so not romance books. But what I was fascinated by them in different ways in each was that there was something unique about each of them in terms of the culture that it was bringing to the idea of romance and how important culture was in how those relationships played out. How do you feel about that, first of all, about being sort of put into a bracket with writers like that and the idea of your work being seen in that way?
I mean, both those writers are great, so I'm already in good company. I think whenever more and more of late, when I've been thinking about my work, my writing practice, my artistic practice overall, and what really fuels that, one of the central threads, I think, is this idea of love and expressions of love, and the chasm that can sometimes exist between how you feel and what you're able to express. And I think in this instance, specifically with thinking about Open Water, but also thinking about like building towards Small Worlds and the work I did for that, so much of it was thinking about the cultural, almost like the kind of like cultural texture that can inform the ways in which we express those feelings and those emotions. And I think from a narrative point of view, I feel like I'm going to be writing these like love stories as such forever, whether that's romantic or platonic or between family members. But so much of what I love is being able to explore the texture around them and the spaces around them and bring those into the text too.
We're going to focus on Small Worlds, of course, as your new book, but I just wanted quickly to touch on something with Open Water, only because I really love that book, and it's one of those books that I kept putting into people's hands and just saying, you've got to read this, got to read this. And one of the things I loved about it was that it was very much about these two people trying to connect. And there were these barriers to that connection, which I found really powered the story. And one of those barriers was the impact, I suppose, of trauma and the trauma that comes from the sort of the impact of racism in your everyday life, if you sort of mean. So these tiny sort of microaggressions and things like that would happen. And that was what made connection with somebody else so difficult. And that in fact, my takeaway was that love could be not the cure for trauma, but the thing that would help you to get over that. How do you feel about my reading of Open Water? Is that a fair assessment of sort of one of the themes of that book?
Yeah, I guess so much of it. There's two things that really emerged as you were speaking. Thinking about the nature of writing a story that includes more difficult moments, includes moments that are like, in this specific instance, are like actually very specifically like racially like, traumatic. And thinking about what it means to exist as a Black person in a world that really codes you as a body and takes you, and that's your starting point. In this instance, I really wanted to write for Open Water for sure. I really wanted to write this novel that could include these really difficult moments and the moments in which you, as a Black person, might not feel like you're being able to be afforded your whole self, or you might feel ugly, or you might feel dangerous in the way that you're being coded, but also the moments where you feel really beautiful and where like the joy of being able to exist as your whole self in the everyday, which brings me to the second point in the ways in which like I think the space is made when you're able to find a way to love and to express that love. And that's where that space is made to feel beautiful and to feel joyous and to really like feel almost celebratory in the life that you're leading. And I think while it's not necessarily a cure or an antidote. It's the beginning of thinking about how the world might look otherwise. In how can you fashion a world that actually does center the love that you might have for yourself, or does center the beauty of the everyday and the beauty of yourself as well.
Mm. That sort of in open water, there is this joyous celebration of lots of black creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's music and there's film and there's literature.
Mm-hmm.
There's also food and
Yeah.
that sort of stuff as well. And this continues in Small Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
With Stephen, we have a slightly different, I suppose, creative and cultural sort of path to follow. So,
Mm-hmm.
having looked at visual arts and photography in open water,
Mm-hmm.
with Stephen, he loves music, particularly
Yeah.
jazz music,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he loves to dance.
Yes.
And I was really intrigued about you continuing this idea of people who are connected somehow to the creative arts,
Mm-hmm.
and that
Mm-hmm.
appreciation of it, and that is part of who they are. Tell me a little bit about sort of locating Stephen and why it was dance and music in particular that worked for him.
I think the from like a kind of bigger picture point of view, the novels that I'm writing exist as part of a loose trilogy about black art and expression and finding liberation through forms of expression. Um, and I think in the instance of Stephen, like I really wanted to take this notion of music and of rhythm that I think that had fueled open water in quite a big way, and bring it to the center stage. Not just even in the fact that he isn't a musician, but actually in the focus on his internal rhythms, the like kind of like his everydayness, those small things which make up our everyday and make up our lives. Um, I also think that there's something about specifically about dance and but music as well that really tied into these feelings I was having about the notion of faith and what it means to believe.
Mm,
Um, Not just in like a traditional idea of a deity or a god, but like in something more than yourself, or in something more for the world. And I think that much in the ways that for many people who do believe in that larger thing, that a church or a religion can provide this sense of like it's almost like ecstasy, right? Like this
mm.
heightened feeling. I think that dance does the same. Like I really wanted to have this mirror um, of an instance in which Stephen too could feel divine. Could go to a place where it was like he was almost like moving out of his own way in order to make way for himself.
The that rhythm that you've just mentioned is really intriguing to me. As you say, there's the similar thing happens in open water, but in Small Worlds, even more so. There's this repetition of textual phrases
Mhm,
and
mhm,
sentences,
mhm,
so that the text has something of music about it. So that
mhm.
repetition that you get from a chorus or a refrain coming
Yeah.
back again. Um, y this is a very stylistic approach to writing, and I imagine must require a huge amount of work on your part in order to get that right. Could you tell me a little bit about that sort of that stylistic approach to the writing and how music has informed the literature?
Um, the work for me, always trying to figure out a way because I really admire musicians and music and the ways in which musicians are able to express emotion with a smaller gap between the emotion and the expression, but
Mm,
also in a really visceral way.
mm.
I think that musicians obviously like they often make us just feel things in like the space of 2 minutes, and I've spent 150 pages trying to encourage this feeling, trying to encourage this notion. I'm just like, well, guys, um but I think there is something about this sense of this sense of rhythm, and actually specifically thinking about my own internal rhythm, which is generally I'm a very excitable person, but the pace of me is very slow. Like it is really it's quite measured. It's quite I noticed this whenever I read. I read the audiobook for Small Worlds a few weeks ago,
Mm.
um, and it was a very steady experience. But like it's quite it is quite slow. It's like almost like a kind of a step back um, from my everyday excitement, and I know that is actually my rhythm. That's
Yeah.
my that's my kind of like, and that's something that I really, that's my first step whenever I'm thinking like what's my rhythm at this specific time, because I think what's really beautiful about any piece of writing, but for me specifically a novel, is this ability to almost take a portrait of yourself in the moments that you're writing that
Mm.
thing, for however ever long it takes you. It's a document of who you are at that time. And so the question for me is always, who am I at this time? And how can I deliver this narrative in a way that's as honest as it can be to who I am at this time? And that then begins to give rise to the sentences, the phrases, the fragments that begin to reappear again and again. Because in I have to trust in a notion of their importance. I have to trust that if I'm being drawn towards them, I'm attracted to them, that there's a reason that they're in that part of the text.
Mm.
Um, so much of my writing process relies on trust and on faith. Small World started as a page of A5, and then every day we have a blank page and
Mm.
a 5 minute panic where I'm sure I've forgotten how to write, and then I get into it. It's like I lean into that space where it's like, actually this unknown space provides so much more space than I could have imagined,
Mm.
than would be possible, I think, for me if I was like kind of planning out beat by beat. Um, and it's just the blank page encourages me to lean into my internal rhythm and in a way to try and make music from my own language.
Mm. Music is, as you say, it's such an extraordinary shortcut, isn't it, to
Mhm,
emotion, so that
mhm.
you can spend several pages trying to get across what you could get if you just listen for a couple of bars.
Yeah.
But did you? I mean, did was it helpful to listen to the music whilst you were writing, or did you have to kind of put that aside and listen to
Oh,
that, as you say, that internal rhythm?
no, no, always. I always have music playing whenever I'm writing. If it's a specific scene that contains something that is playing, I will listen to that song until I'm sick of it. Until the song is until I finish like writing that specific bit.
Yeah.
But for me, it's all about, it really aids in conjuring an atmosphere or conjuring that feeling and trying to give a sense of texture um, to the spaces in which I'm writing about and within. Um, and I think, yeah, like I can point to actually to specific parts of the novel that I know I listened to something that
Yeah.
maybe wouldn't have made its way, isn't mentioned in the novel, but I know, oh, I was listening to that when I wrote that part. And it just, it is a bit of a, it's almost like a bit of a cheat code. It's a bit of a shortcut. It allows me to get closer to my own emotions so that I might like express them better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's and I suppose music is often again a shortcut to memory, so
Yeah.
that people
Yes.
everyone knows that experience of you hear a song and it
Yeah.
immediately takes you back to a time in the past, something. And the other thing I suppose that does that is food as well.
Yeah.
And again, we have lots of food in this book. You keep doing this to me. I read your books and I'm just like so hungry all the time. And of course, I don't live in London anymore, so the access to food like that is just really limited. So
It's an
thank
excuse
you
for you
for
to come back.
tormenting. Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, it's good to visit. But I mean, these are things that you are clearly passionate about, and I suppose
Mhm,
the sharing of that Ghanaian culture, whether
mhm,
that's through food, and of course, Stephen makes a journey back to Ghana
mhm,
in the book.
mhm.
Tell me a little bit about sort of why it was so important to put that so strongly into the novel, and to locate it with that.
You know, um, thinking about the journey that Stephen made, I think there is a version. My One of my editors, my US editor, jokes that the version of the novel that I sold to them was not the version I gave to them. In the best of ways, in the best of ways, in the way that I knew that I was going to try and make space for myself to be surprised by the novel that I was writing. Um, I think as I was coming through the narrative, because it's told in these three specific sections, these three consecutive summers, um, about halfway through the second summer I realized that so much of this novel was about the was about a journey that needed to be made backwards towards the stories of my parents' generation and the stories that they might not necessarily have been able to tell. So while so much of the novel is not necessarily about me or about my family or about my parents, it is really in keeping with the energy of stories that stories and emotions that I've heard or I've glimpsed upon. Um, when I had to write this novel in kind of like these like really intense bursts because I was still touring for Open Water
Mm.
while I was writing. And so what would happen is I would be like out in the world and then I would say to everyone, please go away for a month. And I went and sat in my writing studio and ignored everybody for 30 days. And then I'd come out for some air and I'd go back onto the road. And I did that. I did that twice. And when it came to writing the third summer, I knew, I don't know what it was, there was some instinct in me that I knew I had to go back to Ghana. And at that time, I hadn't been back in 16 years. Um, and so I was really apprehensive, actually. I was
Mm.
even now, as I say it, I can feel that, like, the nerves that were in, like, the depths of my stomach. And I said to my mum, like, I think I want to go. And then Boris closed the country because it was COVID time, and then he opened the country, and I think he closed it again. And when it was open, I was just like, I have like just book the tickets, let's
Yeah.
go. Um, and so 3 days after the paperback of Open Water came out, I flew off to Ghana for 10 days, and it had these ambitions of just being there and finishing off this novel. And I wrote nothing for 10 days. I wrote nothing for 10 days, but I was there, and I like that time was so transformative for me, both as a person as an artist. Less a it was less a kind of like, okay, I'm going back and I've visited now, I've made it back, and more of an opening. It was more of a like, oh, this is the beginning of another part of this sort of lifelong discovery that I've opted into by deciding to write. Um, and I think the time there to be able to like just feel the texture of the place, to be able to taste the food, to
Mm.
be able to feel the heat, there are certain things that happen there that are like they just don't happen anywhere. The light in Ghana is so different. Golden hour lasts about 20 minutes, but like blue hour lasts for 2 hours, and it's just
Mm.
like this incredibly beautiful hue of blue that descends upon everyone at about 5 p.m. It's just like there's this kind of magic that I would have never understood. I would have just been transcribing these memories of my childhood, and I wanted to see it then, like, in the now. Like, I wanted to be like, this is again that idea of like, this is who I am now. I wanted that to feel really honest, and to make that journey for myself as well.
That's really interesting. I can well imagine that plans to write go out of the window when you're there, and there's so much for you to soak up.
Yeah,
Like a sponge. You're just like there's all that experience that you want
yeah,
to get and save for the future.
yeah.
To then write about. I mean that journey of sort of not so much trying to discover who you are, but sort of allowing yourself to you know let that happen and rather than sort of searching for things. And that's very similar to what Stephen's trying to do. He's
Mhm,
trying to, as you say, give himself the space
mhm,
to
mhm.
be himself. And of course, a huge part of that is to do with his relationship with his father,
Yeah,
with whom he is effectively estranged.
yeah.
Um, but he's looking for this connection or to work out what's important. That bond between father and son is always important as part of somebody's development. I think
Mhm,
he says as a young man,
mhm,
or
mhm,
what used to be a young man, is it? It feels to me that it can sometimes be even more important if you're a person of color,
mhm.
and if there is sort of a cultural element to that. Um, is that true, or am I? Is that just my perspective being slightly warped?
I guess it's this notion of, I guess this notion of like, just it's not just the father and son, but it's the community
Yeah.
aspect. This like sense of like these various members of your community that orbit around you that feed into this complete version of yourself, and that doesn't necessarily mean that like you're if you don't have this person, then like you're an incomplete person. But actually, in this instance with Stephen, it's like this knowledge of like of a of a community that he would like to have that includes his mum, his dad, his brother, Dale, his friends, um, and him being estranged from his father was such like a big chasm, is a really big gap in this instance, and I really wanted to explore not only the grief of that gap, but also what might happen if Stephen was kind of like able to renegotiate what that gap could mean,
Mm.
and not in a way where it's like, oh, he doesn't need it, but actually it's like, what does he, asking himself, what does he need, and how can he go towards it? And I think, without spoiling the novel, it's like I think Stephen finds ways to renegotiate on his own terms in a way, that feels like he's, I think especially at that age where everything is so tumultuous and it's
Mm.
just messy and really confusing. I think to have some sense of emotional clarity, to ask yourself what you might need and to action it and to go towards it, was a really beautiful thing to be able to explore.
Mm. Yes, I'm being very careful here not to spoil any elements of this book. You're right, because I think the relationship between him and his father is really beautifully handled, and because it's so complex.
Mhm,
Um, One of the things we were talking about earlier was this idea of phrases coming back. So I'm
mhm,
going to rather brilliantly loop back to that, because one of those phrases is, "It's not that I don't remember, but that I cannot forget,"
mhm,
and that is
mhm,
something that's really appropriate for his relationship with his dad, but and
mhm.
with other people too. Can you tell me a little bit about why that phrase is so important in the book, that it needs to keep coming back?
I think I became to I in the ways that many people start to obsess over certain things. I really began to obsess over this idea and notion of memory.
Mm.
And actually, I think it's probably something that I've been obsessing over for a while. I remember the first time I met my agent. She told me something that I've written down in every notebook I've had since, which is that writing is fictionalizing memory. Um, and this notion of like finding ways to give form and detail and texture and emotion to memories of mine, or memories of my community, or memories of people within the archive that I'm connected to or might look like me, or my ancestors, like I think was something that was really key with this novel, like thinking about like how memory has its way with us sometimes
Mm.
as well,
Mm.
and how reliable memory can be, and the ways in which this idea of I stumbled upon this idea almost a decade ago, of this notion of how memory might work, because no one quite knows how it does, but this notion of like remembering something, and then each time you remember subsequently it being the previous time that you remember, and this memory being like weakened again and again and again, and I wanted to like push and pull and critique at that idea of what it might mean to actually like really like hold on to something in a way that you don't forget the essence of it. The
Mm.
details might fall away, the form might become hazy, it might become nebulous, but like the core, the feeling at the core of it might just remain, and might remain quite hot, and like something that like is almost like too difficult to touch.
Mm.
um that for me felt like such like a burning thing that was pulsing through this novel, the things that we don't always want to remember, but we can't forget.
Mm. And I wanted to ask quickly about connection, because
Mhm.
one of the problems that Stephen has, particularly at the beginning of the book, is his wish to, I suppose, to kind of deal with things on his own,
Yeah.
and he's slightly scared of really connecting with Dell, this
Hmm,
girl
hmm,
that he clearly loves, and this means that when he goes away to university, he falls into a depression, which
hmm,
he really, really struggles with, and
hmm.
he isn't able to talk to anybody about it really.
Yeah.
And it isn't until he's able to talk about that, to make those closer connections with Dell and other people in his life, with his brother,
Hmm,
and
hmm,
then, as you say, to interrogate that relationship with his dad,
hmm,
that he starts, I suppose, to achieve something closer to a happiness, or
hmm.
a more rounded. So therefore, it feels that connection, however difficult that might be, is an incredibly important thing as far as you see it. Would that
Yeah.
be fair?
Oh yeah. I think. I would even go past the point of connection and more towards this notion I mentioned throughout the novel of closeness,
Yeah.
and what that means and what that feels like, like the kind of like intimacy of being close to someone, whether that's physically or emotionally. I think there are there were some parts of the novel that, like, when I was writing, it was like I could actually, often when I'm writing, I feel like, because of my background as a photographer, I feel like I'm cheating again, because it's like these like kind of imagined images or frames that come into my mind's eye, and it's like I'm transcribing what I can see and what the possibilities of those are. And I feel like, as I was writing Small Worlds, like everything felt so much closer. Like
Mm,
it really, it felt like everything was just not necessarily. It felt like the expanse actually was wider, and that the scope was wider, and this definitely felt like a bigger novel, but actually felt like the people that were orbiting these spaces were just closer, and or were trying to achieve some sense of closeness. And I think that for me is like, it's the thing I think I'm looking for in my everyday, not just as an artist but as a person, like this, not just the connection but the closeness.
mm. Um, one of the moments of lovely connection for Stephen is when he's taken, in fact, to a jazz club by a character called Annie.
Hmm.
And she asks him a question which I sort of made me laugh, actually, like, why jazz?
Yeah.
Um, and he says something which I think is really interesting. He says, I've always felt something pushing from just under the surface of me, some instinct to express who I am,
Hmm.
how I feel,
Hmm.
to say I am here.
Hmm. Hmm.
Is that a neat summation of how you feel as a writer?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I feel like I've actually forgot I wrote that. To be fair, that's a while ago. Um, I feel like that's a yeah. Like, I think it's always something that's just, it's a need. You know,
Mm,
it's a compulsion. It's an instinct towards this nature of expression, both to say like I am here, but also to ask where you might be as
mm.
well. You know, that for me is the, I think more and more it's not just the notion of like anchoring and grounding myself, but also asking where the person or people opposite me might be and who they might be too.
Because presumably writing Open Water initially in isolation and before you've had a chance to send it out into the world, do
Mm-hmm.
you find now that we have that connection with readers that it
Mm-hmm.
slightly changes your approach to writing, or is it still very much about you having that time to yourself to create the thing and then send it out into the world?
Yeah, I think the second option. I think I'm so grateful for anyone that chooses to read any of my books, because it is still really baffling to me that, like, I get to, like, not only hold this like kind of part of me that I pulled out for myself, but that other people keep holding it too.
Mm.
I've like bumped into a few people that are reading it on trains of late, which is just like, I was on the Eurostar yesterday actually, and I walked past a woman who was reading it, and I was like, my mind's just flown a little bit. Um, but for me, the most important part of all of this is the process, is being able to make the space for myself to explore an honest and vulnerable version of myself. And I take real joy in how, in like the work, and how beautiful it can be, and actually how difficult it can be
Mm.
sometimes, but it's still overall is a joy. And then every, every reader that comes from the back of that process feels like just like this really wonderful bonus. It feels like I get like something extra from it, because the writing is the joy, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm I'm loath to ask writers what they're up to now, but you rather tantalizingly mentioned that this book is part of a sort of loose trilogy.
Yeah.
So you must be working on something new, and I'm presuming that if it's going to continue looking at Black creativity, I can only imagine the central character is an opera singer. Where are we going
No,
next?
you guessed wrong. You guessed wrong, and I can't tell you, but you guessed wrong. um,
I
I
guessed
think,
wrong on purpose because I
yeah.
thought
Oh,
we
you
can't
just.
be giving stuff away.
I think at the moment, I'm in what I like to call the gestation stage, where
No.
I'm allowing. I have a very tentative title, and I have my characters. and I have perhaps the spaces that I want them to move around in, but I'm just like allowing them to roam about in my mind, for better or for worse, for the foreseeable, really, until it's time.
Yeah.
I'm also working on the screen adaptations of both novels at the moment, which feels really exciting. It feels like it feels less like a difficulty or a burden, and more like an opportunity to make something that expands upon on the original text. And feels like I'm getting another chance to write a new draft, actually, which is
Which is
always
what
handy.
writers really want.
It's always handy.
Yeah, just continuously rewriting.
Yeah, that's it until it's done.
I mean, with that, obviously, with your background in the visual arts, if you like, with photography, I'm presuming that sitting down to write a screenplay of these two books comes relatively naturally. That you can visualize where you're going, and
Oh yeah,
are you enjoying that process?
really, I am. I think because I think there's things that you can do on the screen that you can't do on the page, and vice versa. And so I'm having to continually ask myself, what is it that I can do here that I couldn't have done with the novel, and really actually trying to find a visual language of intimacy to afford both of these narratives in their separate ways.
I'm looking forward to seeing the blue light of Ghana rendered brilliantly on film, because the way you described it, I was like, I can see that. Caleb, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you about Small Worlds and Open Water 2, so thank you so much for giving me the time to do that.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Small Worlds is out now, and for a strictly limited time you can find signed copies on waterstones.com.